Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Wandering Appalachian YouTube channel, where we discuss everything Appalachia, including history, culture, hiking, underwater towns, and whatever else I feel like posting about. If you like topics like this, then you might like it here, so subscribe if you want to see more long-form content from me. But anyway, today I would like to tell you about one of my favorite Appalachian stories, and that is the state of Franklin, or I should say the lost Appalachian state of Franklin. So let's get right into it. How the hell do you lose an entire state? Funny you should ask. As many of you might know, this year, 2026, is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, so fittingly, we need to go back about that far to start this story. America's early years after the Revolutionary War were interesting to say the least. There were only 13 states or colonies, as many of you know, and there were different little pockets of culture that were starting to take shape as America itself started to find its own identity. And one such subgroup, oh my god, sorry, my cat got the zoomies. One of these subgroups was formed by the frontiersmen who decided to take on the less than welcoming terrain of the Appalachian Mountains, cultivating a tough, independent, and scrappy mindset that still persists today in the Appalachian culture. And it is this mindset that led to the short-lived state of Franklin, or I, again, should say the lost state of Franklin. This independent government in the heart of Appalachia may not have lasted for very long, but its story is fascinating, and I think that you'll probably find it pretty interesting too if you have lasted up to this point. So let's start with the concept for the state of Franklin. The two big brains behind this idea for a new state called Franklin were John Sevier and Arthur Campbell. These men were two of many Americans living at the time in what was called the Over-Mountain Towns, which is modern-day East Tennessee. Although at the time, this land, which was west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi River, was all part of North Carolina. So North Carolina was one big, long state that stretched all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. North Carolina wanted to cede this over-mountain land to the federal government to help pay off their debt from the Revolutionary War, which at this point was in pretty recent memory because war, even back then, was a very expensive venture. However, the folks that were actually living in the over-mountain towns were concerned that the United States would then sell this ceded piece of land to a foreign entity like Spain or France to pay off their debt from the Revolutionary War. Bless you. Again, war is an expensive venture, so wanting to take the fate of the land into their own hands and also being dissatisfied with North Carolina's governance, Arthur Campbell and John Sevier went about making their new state. However, Campbell and Sevier disagreed about the boundaries of their new state. Sevier preferred something a little bit smaller, but Campbell had bigger visions for what they could accomplish. He thought that their new state should include parts of modern-day Kentucky, Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. But Sevier acknowledged Campbell's leadership in the venture, and so he went along with Campbell's idea. So off they went to try to carve out some land here and carve out some land there and convince everybody that this new state of Franklin was gonna be just the best idea. But this proved to be unsuccessful. Campbell tried to convince part of Virginia that they should be part of Franklin, but the then governor of Virginia, Patrick Henry, really didn't like that idea. Weird, he didn't like somebody just coming in and saying, "This is mine now." But it's understandable, he didn't want to lose any of his territory to a new state. So he passed a law against creating a new state from Virginia's lands by the cession of state territory. So without this extra land, Franklin ended up being 4 counties, which was still in then North Carolina, today East Tennessee. On August 23rd, 1784, Franklin declared its independence as a state, and they decided that John Sevier should be their governor. Just a side note, John Sevier is another fascinating character in Appalachian history, so let me know if I should make a full video about him, because I think that he is a super interesting guy. So, hooray! There was a new state. What could go wrong? Right? Well, there was one problem. North Carolina did not successfully cede the Overmountain towns to the federal government. So now, this piece of land, which had declared its independence, was being ruled by both the new Franklin government and the old North Carolina government. After the summer of 1785, both governments were ruling in the same land, and as you can imagine, they did not want to do this, and it really did not go over well. So the officials in Franklin knew that if they wanted to retain their independence, they needed higher powers on their side. So in comes their attempts at statehood and schmoozing Benjamin Franklin. Originally, the state of Franklin was called Frank Land, and in fact, that's what it was called in May 1785 when the eager frontiersmen submitted a petition of statehood to Congress because they wanted to become the 14th state in the Union. They needed a 2/3 majority vote to get this, but they did not get it. Only 7 states out of the 13 voted yes. They were just a couple short, which is wild to think about. They were only a couple votes short from us almost having a completely different state in this country, but I digress. This is why history is so cool. And although this was a disappointing blow, John Sevier was not a man to give up so easily, so he had another trick up his sleeve, and in comes his idea that involved Benjamin Franklin. And this is when they renamed Frank Land to Franklin. Do you see where this is going? They thought that if they renamed this state after old Ben, that he would just be so flattered and be like, oh hell yeah, I love this new state idea. With my name on it, let's go. So John Sevier sent Ben a letter in 1785 basically outlining this whole thing, but of course in the 1780s English that they use, which is much fancier than the language that I'm using to communicate to you right now. Unfortunately for John Sevier and the rest of the Franklin supporters, their flattery got them nowhere, and Ben sent them back a very judicious letter that said this: I am sensible of the honor which your excellency and your council thereby do me, but being in Europe when your state was formed, I am too little acquainted with the circumstances to be able to offer you anything just now that may be of importance, since everything material that regards your welfare will doubtless have occurred to yourselves. I will endeavor to inform myself more perfectly of your affairs by inquiry and searching the records of Congress, and if anything should occur to me that I think may be useful to you, you shall hear from me thereupon. Simplified, Ben Franklin basically gave him the runaround and made the excuse, oh, I was in Europe. I was too busy in Europe schmoozing my French ladies to hear about the state that you're making, so I don't know enough about it, but if I hear anything that might help you, I'll let you know. You've probably gotten those texts from people before. You kind of know the gist of what he was trying to say. I feel like I've said schmoozing way too many times here, but alas, the flattery and the schmoozing, it did not work. And then that's when Franklin's downward spiral began. The short-lived endeavor that was the state of Franklin was doomed from the start, and the already existing cracks in their shaky foundation began to widen as time went on. The September 1787 meeting of the Franklin legislature would be its last. In early 1788, the tensions of loyalty boiled over into what is known as the Battle of Franklin. This all started with some tax debts. The state of North Carolina was like, hey, John Sevier owes us some taxes, so what are we gonna do? We're gonna seize some of his property. Under orders from North Carolina, Washington County Sheriff Jonathan Pugh, seized some of the slaves that John Sevier owned as part of their compensation. The slaves were then brought to Colonel John Tipton's cabin for quote-unquote safekeeping. Colonel John Tipton's cabin is now a state historic site, and it is just south of Johnson City. More specifically, it is called the Tipton Hayes state historic site. And I learned through doing this research that they have an event every year that commemorates the Battle of Franklin, which I just missed. It was at the end of February, but let me get into the battle first. The home was built in 1784 by Colonel John Tipton, so this was a fairly new house at the time. It's worth noting that Tipton supported North Carolina, and he was an opponent of our friend John Sevier. John Sevier was mad that his slaves were taken, and so this bubbled over at a skirmish on the property on February 29th, 1788. 2 days prior, Sevier had come to Tipton's property with an army of over 100 men to lay siege to the land. Tipton was reinforced by Colonel George Maxwell, who also came with an army of over 100 men. So after these 2 days, tensions boiled over and it culminated in a 10-minute skirmish, or 10 minutes of fighting. It was more than just a skirmish. This was an embarrassing blow for Sevier, and his army retreated back to Jonesboro. Several men were captured or wounded in the attack, and 3 of them were killed. And this is what we now know as the Battle of Franklin, or the Battle of Tipton House. The rest of 1788 really did not go well for the Franklinites. In late March 1788, a month after the Battle of Franklin, settlements within the state experienced attacks from the Chickamauga, Chickasaw, and other Native American tribes, who, as you can imagine, were not happy that these people were settling in their land. But Sevier was desperate to keep his state together, so he sought a loan from the Spanish government and attempted to place Franklin under Spanish rule. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's weird, because part of the reason that they wanted a separate state in the first place was because they did not want the land of North Carolina to be ceded to the federal government, who might then sell it to Spain or France. But here they are, thinking about selling the land to Spain. I don't know. Desperate times call for desperate measures, but the irony is thick. And this little stunt did not sit well with the North Carolina government, which was vehemently opposed to any foreign power having control in Franklin. Sevier was arrested for this, but he was freed by his supporters, and he hightailed it the hell out of there and went to an area which was known as Lesser Franklin, which is in current day Sevier County. So by this time, everybody pretty much knew that the gig was up. By early 1789, the state of Franklin collapsed and the land was given back to North Carolina. Soon, however, North Carolina wanted to give that land up again, and who can blame them? It's given them a lot of trouble. So North Carolina ceded the land west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi River to form the Southwest Territory, which was the precursor to the state of Tennessee. And in one of the biggest comeback stories of all time, in 1790, John Sevier was elected to Congress to represent the territory, and he became Tennessee's very first governor. Today in Johnson City, you can still see some references to the state of Franklin. There's a State of Franklin road. There are some businesses that use the name, and I think it's an interesting and cool nod to the area's history, because it is significant in that it is known as America's first secession. And now I want to know, did you already know about this story? Did you learn something? And what do you think about the state of Franklin? I think it is a very telling and fitting representation of that scrappy, independent Appalachian mindset, because we as a culture are very insular and unique to the other cultures around us, which is part of why I love it and I find it so fascinating and I want to talk about it all the time. That will be it from me. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more Appalachian stuff, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!